Okay. Apologies as I kind of get used to the technology here. So I left off talking about or pivoting towards attention towards Europe here in the as we continue with kind of the second part, you might say, of our examination of China by 1450 and Europe by 1450. So the previous century, by the mid 1300s, the mid 14th century, Europe was beginning to grapple with this tremendous shock to its social, economic, and political system, the bubonic plague. Again, as I mentioned, this was coming from Asia itself. It's believed that it came out of the areas of Central Asia, moved into China with the advent of the Mongol ascent to authority. And then with it migrated along trade routes, whether it be the Silk Road or the naval trade routes that were beginning to be established and ultimately kind of eclipsed the Silk Road itself. Um, from China to areas of the Mediterranean world and Western Europe. And you can kind of get a sense of that from this graphic here on this slide. It's estimated that some 100 million people died worldwide as a result of the Black Death. Um, an estimated 25 to 50 million of those died within Europe itself. The Black Death first appeared in Europe in the year 1348. At least that's when we first have historical records of it appearing. And it would come to envelop the whole of the European continent by 1351. So this is an incredibly fast moving disease um, that Europeans had no immunities to, because this was the first time that that Europeans were having to come to terms really on a continental scale with this disease. The plague mutated so that it could be transmitted by air. So originally, the original strain coming from China, coming from the Eurasian continent itself, um, was bloodborne. So it was essentially fleas that were harbored this bacteria, and when when they fed on mammals, and then they would hop to human beings and begin to feast on humans. Um, that transmission of blood would also transmit the bacteria, and thus this is how humans began to contract this disease. That original strain was lethal some 30 to 35% of the time. When it became airborne, because bacteria are living and they mutate, when that happened and it became an airborne type of disease, meaning that it could live outside the human body or the host body, this new strain or variety was lethal over 90% of the time, and that happened in Europe. And as a result, the European population as a whole, which was already overpopulated by the mid 14th century as a result of things like the commercial revolutions and the economic kind of security that many European populations felt in the lead up to the mid 14th century. Um, this meant that the society as a whole, the population of Europe, was in prime position to be feel the effects of the Black Death and suffer the greatest consequences as a result. And death was rapid. You have death after one showed first symptoms. Death could occur within a window of 4 to 7 days, and so it was very rapid. As the human body and the immune system tried as best it could to fight off this disease, it quickly became overwhelmed, and in essence, the human body was decaying while the person was still alive in many respects. And there were this had transformative consequences and effects for European society as a whole. First and foremost, it led to kind of massive um, demonstrations of faith. And you can see here how the disease was spread, kind of a rough or a crude kind of um, uh, visual account of how the what the disease and was how the victims were affected. And in essence, there would be bruising all over the body, concentrated mostly in the lymph nodes, um, because because the blood vessels were rupturing, uh, creating these bruises across um, the body itself. Hence the term the Black Death. It first appeared in places like Marseille, also in you can see in Sicily, anywhere in Europe that really had extensive contacts with and served as kind of open ports for receiving goods from outside the Mediterranean region, from the Far East. But I mean, within 6 months, all of the Italian peninsula was under the effects or feeling the effects of the bubonic plague. And as I said, by 1351, it had spread to places like London, as well as areas of Moscow as well. And so this was incredibly fast moving and, as I said, lethal. Now, as far as reactions to this disease and this pandemic, as you might expect, it generated a lot of fear, and we can kind of roughly have a sense of exactly how people felt because we've lived through our own pandemic in our own lifetime with COVID-19. Not nearly as lethal, but in many respects, the same kinds of behaviors were evident. Um, in 2020 as they were in the 1350s. Um, the only difference being, or one difference being, that in the 14th century in the European society, of course, religion was much more pronounced, and as a result, Christians, rank and file Christians, the laity. This is kind of your run of the mill Christians from the peasantry itself began to exhibit radical demonstrations of faith. So they began to turn towards God in an effort to win salvation. And they begin to express and kind of um, characterize their religious devotion in very kind of uh, spontaneous ways. One of these was through the flagellant movement. In many cases, these Europeans, these Christians, believed or saw the plague as God's punishment for the world's sins. And they began to react by publicly demonstrating their faith by beating themselves, oftentimes to the point of drawing blood. And you can see an image here, again, of people barebacked, where they would take cat of nine tails, whips, or anything that they had at hand, and begin to simply just whip themselves over their shoulders, in some cases drawing blood, which probably isn't the best thing to do when there's a bloodborne disease being spread. But again, you know, uh, what is it? Epidemiology wasn't what it is today, and so they weren't necessarily sure or understood how this disease was spread by any means. But this was done from a religious perspective as a sign of penitence and, kind of offering up and trying to absolve themselves of sin in order to gain God's forgiveness. What's also important to understand about the flagellant movement here is that it was not sanctioned by the church. That is to say, that the Pope and the papacy, the um, priests and the clergy were not the orchestrators of this movement. That it was basically this spontaneous kind of grassroots effort from the among the laity themselves, the church-going population. There was also, as another kind of demonstration of faith, persecution of Jews. That there was anti-Semitic behavior that began to be exhibited mostly in places like southern France, but quickly it began to spread across Europe, especially in times of, uh, you know, peaked fear. When the Black Death seemed to be just running roughshod throughout European society. Um, that in many cases Christians saw this as saw the Black Death um, as a pestilence that was some sort of Jewish conspiracy, that it was a sign of God's displeasure, that this segment of the population throughout Europe was not abiding by the Christian practices. Um, and so as a result, this was, kind of a motive or an excuse or a means of trying to engage in anti-Semitic behavior. There were some drastic results and significant shifts in the um, behavior and the kind of composition, you might say, of European society and a reorientation, you might say. And this came in a number of different ways. First and foremost, with regard to agriculture, with a population collapse, and that's basically what this was when you lose 25 to 50 million people within a continent and within a generation. This meant that the population contracts, and therefore the number of mouths to feed and the people to support is reduced, and the pressure on trying to cultivate crops in order to keep people fed uh, began to be minimized. And so, as that happens, food prices began to fall as well because the demand for food was um, declining. And as that happened, farmers in Europe began to turn to growing a wider variety of crops. So, in times of high food demand, farmers typically, during this period of time, would resort to planting a greater amount of cereal crops, grains, oats, barley, in order to maximize the yield from each acre of land that they had. Uh, what happens when you do that is that the diet, the overall kind of you know consumption of vital vitamins and minerals is not available. And so the health of individual Europeans was rather poor on the eve of the Black Death. Another reason why the Black Death was so lethal is that the immune systems were not properly uh, strengthened in order to kind of be at their peak in order to fend off this disease because their bodies were not getting the nutrients that it needed in order to be able to combat this infection. But when the population collapsed, those surviving farmers could then begin to diversify their crops once again, so that they began to use some of their land in order to establish vineyards and grow grapes, or to begin to turn land over to pasture for cows for the purposes of providing dairy products. Um, Fruit trees and other kinds of orchards would also come back. And so, as a result, when you begin to, when farmers offer up a variety of edible goods, this means that the people themselves can benefit from getting the nutrients that they need. Another area that benefited from the Black Death was with regard to labor. Again, with population collapse, there are fewer workers in which to do jobs. And so when you have a large labor pool, this means that the advantages lie with the employer. That wages are typically depressed when you have a large labor pool from which to choose. And so as a result, workers are kind of at the mercy of their employers as far as employment is concerned, and also the wages that they get for their work. Well, again, within a very short period of time, once the Black Death begins to emerge in Europe, this changes, it flips on its head, where the workers, after the initial kind of wave of Black Death moves through, those that were able to survive that initial first contact uh, had the advantage that they could negotiate a higher wage for their work because now the labor pool was constricted. Also, the disease does not discriminate, which created new opportunities for social advancement within the hierarchy of European society and across European society. Landlords, for example, were at the mercy of those looking to buy or rent property. And so, as a result, if people had money, then they were in a position to begin to um, increase that wealth for themselves. And also, with people dying, this meant that wealth was in a state of flux. There was also a social and kind of cultural mentality that went along with the Black Death as well. This can best be described as people beginning to focus and teaching increasing amounts of attention on getting the most that they could out of life while they were still in good health. That instead of the kind of traditional religious piety that was characteristic prior to the Black Death, one where you would deprive yourself of kind of creature comforts or luxury or higher standards of living because you were trying to prepare your soul for the afterlife, and that the whole kind of mortal life was of little consequence. And it was really the afterlife and attempting to achieve salvation for oneself that was the key focus. Well, that changes almost immediately during and after this initial bout with the Black Death. That people instead begin to try and embrace this idea of a live for today type of mentality. Um, that they wanted to surround themselves with creature comforts. I mean, why not? You know, you're not sure if you're going to be alive this time next week, so why not live it up? And this began to fly in the face of long established religious practices of devotion and this sense of piety. So the very nature and the very kind of orientation, but also the kind of identity itself, you might say, of Europeans begins to change and change rather drastically, rather quickly. Also, work begins to define one's uh, importance and provide for a sense of legitimacy and existence rather than religious devotion. So think of it in these terms, where as society begins to collapse around you, very quickly communities begin to want to become more self-sufficient. That they want to try and isolate themselves for the sake of not having anyone come into the community and introduce disease. But when that happens, you're going to depend more heavily on those people within the community itself. And so as a result, what you do, what skills you have, what profession you devote your time and energy to becomes of prime importance to not only your own survival, but the survival of the community of which you're a part. And so work, becomes an identifying characteristic that people begin to rally around for themselves. That so when people say, "Who are you?" you would say, "Well, I'm a blacksmith, or I'm a miller, or I'm a tanner." Um, that you define yourself according to your skill set. And with the large kind of loss, in some cases, of skilled labor, knowledge and technology begin to become more heavily relied upon. There's an emphasis here in the wake of the initial encounter with Black Death that Europeans begin to focus on um, crafting more accurate timepieces in order perhaps to make the most of the time that they had. Why is that important? Well, it's going to be play a fundamental role when it comes to the exploration age, because time is going to help you understand and orient yourself as to where you are with regard to where you've been. So as sailors begin to um, move across open water and they lose sight of land, then they're going to rely on time and clocks that are going to kind of give them an idea as to where they believe they are with regard to where they were from or traveling from. And we do that today. I mean, GPS is a measure of, time. I mean, coordinates are, hours, minutes, and seconds in many cases, in addition to degrees of latitude. Medicine becomes kind of uh, more grounded in the practice of things like experimentation and pharmacology. That people begin to try and understand how this disease was transmitted, how to prevent how to mitigate and kind of curtail its spread in many cases. Education also became less formalized. Traditionally, again, formal education was dictated by the church, and the language of the Christian or Catholic Church by this time was Latin. Well, that meant that in order to take up formal study, you had to first learn Latin, which could take a number of years. And now, during the Black Death and afterward, people abandoned trying to learn Latin and instead tried to learn within and through their own vernacular languages. Vernacular languages being that of Italian, French, Spanish, English, German, and what have you. And so what that means is that you wouldn't even before you begin your studies, you would have to learn this dead language, Latin. Now that prerequisite was no longer the case, and people were going to begin to try and learn and spread knowledge through the use of vernacular languages. This is key to the onset of the Renaissance itself. And of course, there would be a general embrace of technology to replace the brain drain, the loss of skilled crafts workers as a result of this epidemic. We see the introduction of things like the crossbow, a more readily use of things like gunpowder and firearms, and also glasses, eyeglasses, begin to be used during this period of time. Crude as they were still kind of depended upon. Why rely on technology? Well, it reduces the time it takes to train people to do certain tasks, and it leads to greater efficiency, which is symptomatic of our own modern age today. I mean we're always looking for quicker ways to do things to get more done in a shorter amount of time. Well, that mentality, that aspect, is largely as a result of something like the kind of changes, shifts, developments coming out of the Black Death itself. We may have to go into another segment of recording here, but for the time, we'll move on as quickly as we can into the Renaissance. So almost, and it's no coincidence here that roughly a half century to a century later, we see Europe undergo and begin to benefit from a sustained Renaissance. Renaissance meaning rebirth. The key characteristics included that of the kind of general embrace of humanism. This is again a popular embrace of trying to understand an individual's place in the universe. That really, for the first time in European uh, experience, or at least since antiquity, Europeans were coming to realize that, hey, maybe this mortal life should be enjoyed, should be studied. It holds some intrinsic value in and of itself, and therefore should be studied, should be kind of given due credit and have value attached to it. And so poets and other literary figures, artists also, began to focus attention on human subject matter, emotions, or philosophical questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? These are kind of humanist types of approaches and philosophies and questions. It was essential in many cases to understanding what it means to be human, and that this uh, aspect of existence was worthy of attention. And that's exactly what humanists and humanism catered to. They believed in many cases that this was key to developing one's full potential. Um, and it also began to cultivate an interest in the humanities and the liberal arts. So things like history, literature, art, all of these are embedded within the humanities themselves. And the emphasis here, I think you can see, hopefully, is on identity. When you begin to talk about histories or literature or art, you are using the human experience, the human form, as a basis of subject matter. And this required, in many cases, a return to studying classical literature from antiquity, which helped to promote and cultivate a sense of reconnecting Europeans of the Renaissance era with the ancient past. And this was known as antiquarianism, to dig up, to revive the classics, the classical philosophies of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, to try and preserve as best as possible the ancient histories and legal codes of the Romans and Greeks. Um, Anything that was kind of the foundation of Western civilization itself from antiquity was now seen as, you know, a prized possession among Renaissance thinkers and also people from the era itself. This was also kind of forwarded, you might say, kind of accelerated by the embrace of new technologies, specifically in the 1440s with the invention of the printing press, or I should say, the printing press with movable type, that was thanks in large part to the efforts of Johannes Gutenberg. Again, he was one who began to develop a printing press in which individual letters, movable type, was able to be arranged to form the words and the sentences on a specific page of text. And then you'd ink that up. You'd set down the paper, you put it into the press, and the inked letters would transfer to print on that page. That was so much more efficient and so much quicker um, in accelerating the printing process than trying to carve out a full page of text at each and every turn. And so as a result, what this meant is that if you're able to print pages more quickly, you print more books more quickly. And therefore, if you print more books, each book, the unit cost for each book drops. And when that happens, this means that these books can be sold for cheaper prices, meaning that knowledge, information, entertainment could spread more quickly across a broader cross section of European society. And again, these are books that are mostly being printed in the vernacular languages. So it really can't be um, denied how important something like the printing press was to it, and its convergence with the Renaissance era. And so, as a result, knowledge itself was spreading not only more quickly, but more cheaply as well. Excuse me. There were also humanistic qualities that were, of course, exhibited in the arts and philosophy. And my time here is almost up for this half-hour segment, so I will continue speaking till it's out, but then I'll pick up in a third segment. So art is going to be, oh, that's what we got. Okay.